And we're really here to tap into that wonderful Global Innovation Forum community and use some of that knowledge and some of the marvelous speakers that we've had over the years to share expertise and insight into how to turn what is, let's not beat about the bush, a disastrous pandemic in many, many respects. But how do we find the silver lining within that? How do we turn a problem into an opportunity? I think it was Churchill who said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And that's what we're trying to do here, to take a positive approach to this. So I'm Tom Ellis, I'm CEO of Brand Genetics, which is a strategic growth consultancy, and I'm going to be hosting today. Over the course of the webinars, there'll be a series of different hosts or kind of conversations going on. And, today we've got the marvelous Stephen Gates, who is joining us from the good US of A. Stephen, in fact, I don't know, whereabouts in the US of A are you joining us from?
Well, unfortunately, these days, I think in these days, the worst place to. So I live, thankfully, just outside of New York City. We moved out probably about 10 years ago. And I think for all my friends who used to make fun of me for like not being in the city, the jokes have definitely stopped. But glad to be here.
Oh, well, that's fantastic. And we're very much looking forward to picking your brains and hearing your insights. For those of you who don't know Stephen, he's Head Design Evangelist at InVision. He's an award-winning design leader who's led in-house and agency creative teams, building multiple Fortune 100 brands and working with some of the world's most innovative creative companies like Apple and Google, Nike, Airbnb, WeWork, Disney. Currently, I'm addicted to Disney Plus, Stephen. So I'm also addicted to his podcast, The Crazy One. I highly recommend it. When I heard Stephen talk last year at the Global Innovation Forum, I dipped in, but now I'm a huge fan. This is a real treasure trove of actionable insights. And if you haven't listened to the ones on trust, which is, I know, a big theme I'm sure we'll touch on today, or podcast 99, with a wonderful summary, which I've shared with my whole team, I highly recommend it. thecrazy1.com, thecrazy1.com. We also have in the background here, Chris and Josh from Live Illustration. And these guys are going to be drawing away in parallel with Stephen's talk. We'll be spotlighting their progress from time to time. And at the end, I think we'll come back and just share the wonderful sort of illustration and see how that's coming out. But anyway, Stephen, on to our topic, which is about leading remote teams. And obviously, for most people in the world of design and innovation, people will be working from home. And every indication is that this is certainly something we've got to cope with in the short term, but actually in the longer term, this will be something that's here with us for rather more. Maybe the office will return in different forms, but certainly it seems that not only will people feel they'll need to work from home more, but that they actually want to work from home more. But it does come with challenges. And I wonder if we can just start with a quick poll, maybe Max, if you wouldn't mind pulling this up. What we'd love to ask you guys all is, what is the remote leadership challenge you feel is most impacting you right now? So what are the challenge, the negative, the hardest thing really that you're finding about remote leadership? And you can just click on this and then, submit, and we'll see where we come up. And hopefully, when Max has got a decent enough set of numbers, when we think most people have submitted, we will be able to see some results. We've got Max working tirelessly away in the background to make sure, as he always does, things run smoothly. Okay, so here you go, Stephen. I trust you can see this as well. Yeah. A lot of heat around switching off. That's the standout. Managing team members, focusing on the right tasks, dealing with colleagues' issues. Not so much around performance or the right tools or reduced productivity. So, but quite a balance there. Stephen, you lead remotely. InVision is entirely remote. talk to us about your experience of the key challenges.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know what. I mean, the interesting part is, so yeah, I joined InVision a little over 2 years ago. We were, since we were born in 2011, had been completely remote. I think the interesting part is obviously, and that's the disclaimer I always put on my advice, is as I very well recognize that sort of being born remote is different than we were in person and were kind of pushed into remote. I think the biggest, so for all the teams that I'm talking to and coaching, I think some of the biggest challenges that sort of belie a lot of what people are struggling with. I think one is whenever you sort of make that shift, it really exposes all your organizational sin. So if you had more managers than leaders, if you didn't have, like, because again, one of the big things is that all of a sudden everybody has to actually trust their employees. Like that seems to be a really crazy thing where like so many people I talk to, their first question is like, well, how do I know my people are working? And my first question to them is, what the hell kind of culture did you build that's your first question? So I think, if you have bad process, bad infrastructure, all of that comes to the surface because we used to sort of lean on that shared context of being in an office. We all could be together. And that's why, again, so many of the conversations, because apparently creativity didn't exist before hallways, because everybody's like, well, how can we be creative if we can't run into each other in the hallway? And like, look, I'm not going to minimize that. I understand. But I do think it did sort of become a bit of a crutch for a lot of those sort of things. And in many cases, I think what it's really exposed are the things we probably should have been working on all along, were these sort of issues of trusting your team, pushing power down through the organization. Yeah, again, rethinking leadership models, because a lot of the leadership models I see are great for the leader, but not good for the team. And that now, whenever this is so sort of different, that's what happens. And I think the thing that you see is that one, and that's the thing I'll always point out, right? Like, this is not probably what remote work will be. Because I think, for me, that's always the difference, is like work from home is one thing. I think, what we'll get back to is work from anywhere, which is different. Because then I think that's a huge upside whenever you can say, look, if you want to go on vacation for 2 weeks and 1 week is vacation and you want to work out of the hotel for a week, great, do that. I've worked with people who work out of like RVs and they just drive around and the scene changes because all you need is a Wi-Fi connection. So again, I think that there's a lot of those sort of things that we'll see evolve in the mentality. But no, I definitely think that that's the other, like the switching off part, I think is the hardest part, because there's a lot of sort of institutional and legacy kind of thinking and baggage we bring into this with us. And we used to, the reason why that happens is because there used to be a context switch, right? Like you would get up in the morning and you would be at home. There was some sort of a commute. Then you went into an office, some sort of a commute, and you were at home. So you had sort of 2 blocks of personal time with a block of time for work in the middle. Well, now that's all been put into a blender. And, you have to context switch on a minute by minute basis of going from being a teacher to a chef to a counselor to like trying to get work done, trying to design something. And that, I think for a lot of people, because I mean, look, I've been doing this for 2.5 years. If I go to the grocery store in the middle of the day, I still feel like I'm doing something wrong. And
so Stephen, have you got any tips? Because that's everyone's biggest, not everyone's, but a lot of people's biggest challenge. Having done this for 2 years, and as you say, you still sort of have that institutional baggage a little bit. What are some of the tools and techniques that you've learned to help people?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, because I think that is and I think this is why, if you look at the numbers, actually it'll show that remote workers are, like, even the most conservative number is 10% more productive.
Yeah.
Because I think you actually do run into a problem of shutting off. And so, like, the thing that I'll try to do is, one, set hours of like, when do I start, when do I stop, and try to, the same way that, like, even if my commute is 5 steps, there is something about, okay, look, we're going to go cook dinner, we're going to prioritize those sort of things, right?
Yeah.
I think for me, I try to never work for more than 2 to 2.5 hours without a half an hour break.
Yeah.
And so I will set up my schedule that way, because I think even just like walking between a conference room, going to the bathroom, grabbing lunch, like even if you eat at your desk, this will wear you out so much faster than like 2 hours or 3 hours of this. And will burn you out faster than a whole day of work. And that's why I said, it's like, look, go walk the dog, go do a little exercising. Like meditation is a big one, I think, that does those sort of things. I think you can change the environment about where do you sit in your house. You'll start to see, like, early days, there's always that like blank wall with bad lighting. And then by week 2, there's sort of like one photo. And by week 3, it's like perfect lighting and they look like an Instagram influencer. But I think doing those sort of things, and a lot of it for me is also calendar management. Like every day from 12:30 to 1, I have a meeting that says eat. There are 3 blocks in my week that are 2.5 hours long that say work. Because I think that especially in this switch, you need to recognize the mentality that, in many cases, companies overcompensate and they flood calendars with meetings that are just like FOMO. Hey, I need to just check in with you 2 or 3 times. Like those sort of drive you crazy with that stuff. And so I think it's that sort of thing of just being deliberate about how do you structure it and sort of treat it like, okay, I'm going to have hours, I'm going to have these sort of things. I think that helps a ton. But I also think a big part of it is just working with your team
Yeah.
on basic things like how do you communicate? Like, hey, if I send you an email, get back to me today. If I send you a Slack, get back to me and get back to your desk. If I text you, that's like the red bat phone, like I need you right now. But I think that those sort of things, that all that will sort of help, I think, get rid of some of that churn and anxiety.
It's interesting you say that. We've just introduced user manuals, personal user manuals, inspired actually by a previous GIFT speaker. And we were putting these in place just before lockdown came, and it was super helpful. We've added a bit about sort of working from home and hours and things like that. But it is got those elements of, if you need me, this is the quickest way to get.
Right.
And I think that some of that, you talk, I think, about deliberate. How are you deliberate in what you do and how you act? And I think that so much of things are assumed, and when you're not there face to face, that sort of eye contact, almost that ability, that sort of nod and a smile that gives you that kind of sense of assumption is lost, and so you have to be that much more deliberate.
Well, yeah, because I think that's what a lot of the physical context gave us, was it got rid of a lot of assumptions.
Yeah.
I could walk down the hall. I could see what you were doing. I could see what was on your monitor. I could see who was meeting. I could see, and so that, again, that gave me context. Well, now whenever I can't see that, people start to make a lot of assumptions. And so, yeah, I think, my argument has been, I think the things that we all need to work on were things that we always needed to work on. And that, whenever we go back to whatever normal is going to look like or things like that, investing in these things are just going to make the team stronger. But yeah, I think that's where a lot of it will get into trouble, is whenever we assume somebody is working. Or again, there's one company I had to sort of coach them off the ledge, because they were literally watching the status light on people's Slacks. And if it wasn't green the whole time, then like they would be like, why aren't you working? What's going on? It's like, look, so again, I think, it's fighting this almost like always on mentality. Because again, like people weren't always available when we were in the office, and it's sort of ridiculous that we feel like, well, why didn't they respond right away? So like I said, I think just sort of being realistic and being deliberate in how do you communicate, how do you work, and that's what I said, is I think the best teams that I've been around were that way anyway, but it's just like, okay, great, let's carry it over into here.
Yeah, 100%. So what do you think good, I mean, you're a leader, you work remotely with teams. What does good look like? What does good remote leadership look like? And what are the behaviors we should be modeling as leaders for our teams?
Yeah, I think, for me, that was sort of one of the biggest switches, because like before this, when I came out of Citibank, I'm like, oh, there are multiple global studios. Like I understand. And I think the only thing I understood was just how bad I was at it. I mean, I think, like, look, the behaviors for me, the biggest one is how easy it is for people to suffer in silence. It is really easy to turn this thing on, to put on a performance for 30 or 60 minutes, to be super happy and energetic, and then sort of turn your camera off and feel like you've never been more disconnected or sort of, again, away from what's going on. For me, it's very much about just how do you empower empathy, and how do you really just, and empower vulnerability? Because I think, I think the upside is, I think this will let you get to know your team in ways you never imagined, and so much deeper, because, you can show up to work with sort of a mask on. This lets you see people's homes, what's on the shelves, kids come in, dogs come in, like, and so again, there's a very different look to that. But I think there very much there needs to be a real investment. And I think in many cases in creating spaces for conversations, not necessarily always giving answers. We do things like we have anxiety parties, where it's just everybody show up and talk about what are you stressed about, and how do we, again, connect people who are going through similar things. How do we give them context if that's normal? How do we bring in outside speakers? But I think a lot of it is that of sort of saying, look, just saying, hey, we're doing great, or we start a meeting and just jump right into business is not a very good best practice. I think that there's just, there are those sort of things about how do you invest in people, create that space, be able to kind of do that. And I think, again, it's also really being aware, especially as a leader, of what are the ripples you're sending out through your actions. Like for me, I don't have kids and I don't sleep, right? So I think, if you send me an email, see, right on cue, that's perfect.
My daughter has just appeared.
Oh yeah, no, I was in a company meeting a couple of weeks ago whenever like one of our executives' sons came in and introduced himself with the whole company in his underwear. Like it happens all the time.
You meet the Global Innovation Forum? No, she doesn't. Hopefully my wife will appear like that professor in Hong Kong and whisk her away. Okay, he's downstairs. Now run along. Anyway, but I think, but these are the sorts of things that are part of life, as you say, and they're, this wasn't perfectly set up, but it is a perfect illustration of you get to see, behind the mask, as it were.
Right.
Like, you get to see people. And I think embracing that is important, isn't it?
And I think that's a lot of those sort of things. I mean, because that's why I said, like, I don't have kids and I don't sleep. So if you email me at 11 o'clock at night, I'll probably write you back. But, again, I don't want to set that precedent and make people feel like they need to be always on. So it's like, great, put it in a folder and send it the next morning. Again, like, to be able to say that thing of like, look, let's leave our cameras on. Let's leave our microphones on. Like, yeah, look, kids come into the room, stuff comes up, people burn, the fire alarm goes off because the kids start to burn pop. Like, that's just sort of all part of it. But I think, at least then there's a bit more of a shared experience.
Yeah.
Because that was the big connection that we all had, was we had some sort of a commute and we showed up in the same physical place, right? Like there was a context we all shared. This has now been shattered where everybody has their own individual context. So in many cases, I think a lot of the questions around that feeling of loss of teamwork or things like that, that's a lot of what that is. It's like, okay, well, since we aren't all occupying the same space, we don't feel like we're connected.
And there's a great question here from one of our attendees, Victoria, who asked, how do you create true team spirit in this remote working mode? So much of team building is about going and, I don't know, paintballing or cocktail making, whatever it is. How do you do that in a remote working environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of, and I think for a lot of us, probably more translates than we think.
Yeah.
Again, you can still do happy hours. We've done that where like we'll do a meeting and everybody goes and gets dressed up and comes back with their own cocktail. I think you can do that. I think a lot of it is looking at how are you using your tools? Like, again, that's one of the things that I love about the way we use Slack, because it's like, yes, there are ways that are all professional and, what do we want to get done? But there's a channel about pets and babies and cars and food. And again, it's that ability to create teamwork and bonding outside of work. I think that always works really well. Like I said, don't jump right into meetings. One of the big tricks that I do for a lot of people is also, that ability to have culture or teamwork. A lot of it comes out of how do we work and define mentality and things like that. So like, again, at InVision, we have like 8 values that you have for the company. So you get this like deck of cards.
Right.
They're numbered. And if you're in a meeting and somebody's doing something that really models our values, you can call them out. If you're in a place where, again, maybe we need to be doing a bit more of that, you can call that out. Like, I think that's really great. There's 2 other things for me that I love. One is that there's a bot that we use inside of Slack called Donut. And every week, Donut will just go basically set up a virtual coffee for 2 people inside the company.
Yes.
So it's just, if there's somebody you've never met before, great. There's a half an hour to go spend time with an engineer or somebody else. Great sense of teamwork around that. And then there's another service that we use called Bonusly, which is every month, everybody in the company gets $50, and you can give it as your own personal bonuses to other people in the company any way you want. I can give one $50 one or $51 ones or any denomination. But I think a lot of that sort of just like recognition, that sort of team building, that sort of like, hey, you did something really great. I think that there's a lot of just those sort of simple ways. And in many cases, what I'll tell people to do is like, what worked before?
Yeah.
If it was happy hours. If it was like paintballing can become virtual. Like, again, like you can use Spotify and they have a shared music service. So you all can listen to the same music during the day. So again, I think there's a lot of those sort of things. You may just have to kind of rethink them.
So just the 3 things that I really, in terms of leadership then, it's about being explicit and being kind of clear and deliberate in your actions. It's about, I think this point about empathy and empathizing with people's situation and being, it's okay if your daughter walks in or if you're feeling stressed.
Right.
I think we had a situation where we're trying to be calm and kind of collected as a leadership group, but also you can send the wrong message, which is, hey, everyone should be kind of cool and happy. I mean, you know, the world's blowing up, but actually it's okay to freak out, you know. And then this creating moments for social connection, you know, offline, relaxed, I mean, offline in terms of off the sort of meeting channels, as it were. I think that's so rich, and finding those, it's the water cooler moment, isn't it? You know, it's grab a coffee, it's the talk about the dog or the Star Wars movie or whatever it was.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's what I said, is I think those are the sort of things that we had. So that ability to bring that back, that ability to, again, sort of still prioritize that connection, that ability to do those sort of things. But yeah, I definitely think, you know, that is that sort of part of it for me around leadership, is that it really is, how do you create that? How do you make it okay to not be okay?
Yeah.
Because in many cases there's that thing, and that's where I sort of talk about the performance, is like, look, if I'm not 100% today, if I'm not feeling great, then I feel like I need to show up and sort of put on the happy face, and then that starts to feel very disconnected. Because if we were in person, I could see that you're eating alone. I could see your body language. I could, and again, I don't get the benefit of that here to be able to do those sort of things. So I think, you know, that ability to do those sort of things really goes a long way. But I think it's also, there's also the recognition of why this is so important, because, you know, your team or your company is not going through this alone. And a few too many of the leaders who I think were like that shelter in place order seem to extend to their brain, where and I think this last week or two has sort of hit a breaking point for a lot of different teams, right? Because I think either they're like, look, our leadership is not evolving, they are not getting it, they don't seem to care. Like, as soon as I can come up with something else, I am out of here. Like, it is going to drive a crazy attrition rate. Or there's been a pocket of teams that I talk to who are like, and it's interesting because the conversation shifted where they're actually afraid of going back to the office because they're going to lose the new ways they've started to create to work because they're so much better.
Okay.
I think that it is also that recognition that, like, look, if you're not willing to evolve and sort of invest in these things, your best people will go places that do, because, you know, that, I think you had that great point about sort of what forced your evolution. And, you know, again, this is forcing evolution for a lot of people.
Yeah. So we've got a popular question here, which I think is I've certainly heard of a few people in this situation. And it's really about someone starting a new job remotely. Mm-hmm. And again, I think there are people who are hired into new roles, or, you know, whether it's been during the situation or before and they've been starting, and that can feel very disconcerting. You know, the question here is, it's not a very trivial process to get onboarded, get immersed in cultural company culture. And then also, if you're in a management role, or, you know, and we're all managing, right? Whether it's up, down, across. But if you're dealing with other people who you don't know on a face-to-face basis, how does that work? Again, I'm sure you've had experience of this.
Yeah.
So,
no, I think the onboarding one is a fantastic question, because I think actually for us, so when you come into InVision, you get about 40 to 50 hours of onboarding your first 2 weeks.
Right.
And I think this is probably one of the biggest areas that's going to need a fundamental rethink, because that's sort of like, you know, in my past jobs, you sort of got a laptop and somebody said good luck and you'd go figure it out on your own. I think one is, you know, you need to help people understand, what does good look like? How do you set a routine? How do you find a place? Again, I think like we do that. I know Google and others have done it where like you even get a budget, where if you want to get something for your home office and set it up, like, again, that's going to be a very different thing. A lot of it for me is just sort of spending time with them and do the onboarding that you would have done before, right? Like, start with that as a basis. Like I said, we don't need to completely overcorrect on those things. So there were just some fundamental things that you probably did, but again, you may need to be a little bit more deliberate, because where you might have left it up to happenstance of, like, you know, just ask somebody a question. I think a lot of it is, again, sort of helping them with the behaviors of what, you know, how do we communicate? What, you know, when is a good time to ask a question? How do you, I mean, again, I think though that is the time as a leader or something like that to meet with them at a minimum of once a day, if not maybe multiple times a day. Like, again, check in on them, try to be actively reaching out, try to then also make sure you're connecting them to as many other people as you can. So if it's like, hey, let's get on a call for half an hour and here are all your key stakeholders or whatever it is, and here is, you know, new person X, and that then we can do those sort of things. So I think that sort of thing of helping them, getting them connected with IT, like, again, just sort of those things. And I think the first time's always the worst, but I think as you do that, document what that is, put together those sort of links, because I think that was the great part, is like, whenever I came in, somebody said, great, here's everything you're going to need in one Google Doc.
Yeah.
It was like, if you want IT, and here's how you sign up for email, and here's how you do, and here's how you, and it was just like, oh, okay. So then, yeah, I just spent my like first day going down through that list to get everything set up. But I think that ability to do that, definitely helps quite a bit. But yeah, I think there's just going to be that also, again, give them a little bit of a break, understand they're going to need to ramp up. And I think just sort of watch how they're doing and check in with them.
No, I think that's, that's true. As you say, I think what you're reinforcing for many of us is that it doesn't all have to, it's not baby out with the bathwater, right?
No, 100% no.
It's just try and be creative about the way you apply it. And I think, back to your point about team spirit, I think, how do you build that? How do you create those moments for social connection? That's as true in onboarding, because, there's where is everything and who do you contact? But there's also the, meet Stephen for a coffee and
right.
that sort of thing as well. So,
and I think even, go and talk to HR, because that's like one of the things that we do is we onboard in classes.
Right.
So that even if you, again, instead of just saying, okay, look, this one person comes on, and again, it depends on the rate that you're hiring, but even if it's 2 or 3 people who can start on the same date, and that you can connect them and you can go through the basics with them, then at least they then feel like they have a small tribe or some connection of like, hey, have you figured this out, or doing those sort of things. But no, 100%, because for me, the things that you need to invest in are the things that are going to be sustainable, right? Like if it's just we're going to overcorrect and do something just for remote, then again, we're going too far the other way, because these should be the things that if we go back to whatever way we're going to work, are the things that will carry through in person, remote, like all these sort of different ways of doing things.
So, Stephen, we've got a lot of innovators and obviously people from a design background sort of listening in to us today. And as somebody's pointed out here, there's a real sense of, and I've heard this from other kind of clients of mine, actually you have to innovate with empathy for your designers and your R&D teams who can't prototype in the way that they might have, who can't all be together in the lab or prototype and touch and feel some of those materials. Again, are there ways that you can kind of work around that remotely, or are some of these things just, do get lost in the challenges of remote work?
Yeah, no, I think, obviously the easier part are digital deliverables, because we can go into a Word doc, we can go into, we can fire up an InVision prototype, whatever it is. I think that some of the physical prototypes are going to be, and those physical experiences are where this is going to become a bit more challenging. Now, I've seen this with some teams where if it's like materials, they will kind of like bulk ship. So instead of just having one material shipped to like the office, they're having it try to ship to everybody. So there's some sort of a shared experience. If there are engineers who are working on something, again, their ability to show it, to demonstrate it, to try to get, so again, it's like we can do this sort of thing, but I know that I'm going to need to ask questions, and no, maybe that's not going to be as good, but again, is there some way to be able to approximate it? I think I've seen some companies who are actually doing like physical prototyping or things like that, but they're doing it with like objects everybody has around the house.
Right. Yeah.
So it's just sort of like, okay, look, instead, like, yeah, we would have loved to be able to like CNC it or put it on a 3D printer, but can we do it with a rubber band and a Tide box, right? Like I said, I know that isn't ideal, but again, I think that ability to try to get a little bit more innovative or try to be able to figure out how can we do those sort of things. I think, there's a big part of the process of doing the whiteboarding, of doing like a lot of the ideation piece that can still be shared. But yeah, that's what I said, is I think those are the parts where it's going to be sort of rethought. Or again, I think, there's some, and again, they tend to be smaller teams who have started to buy designers 3D printers or started to do things like that, so that then, great, here's the file, everybody print it tonight. Then that way in the morning, we all have something that we can look at and approximate and work with. So again, I think there's going to be a bunch of those sort of different things we're going to need to think through.
Are there particular tools that you guys have sort of lent into? I mean, obviously you guys have, as InVision, a lot of tools, but
Yeah. No, this is the complete, unabashed, self-promotion thing. I mean, look, the one for me that was a game changer for me that I didn't really use before I got here that I live on right now are those sort of online whiteboards. Like we have one called Freehand, and it's like literally we've had hundreds of people, and you can do post-it notes, and you can do group sketching, and you can sort of go in and do work. You can do facilitated workshops. You can do, I think that like that is a huge, like anything where you sort of level the playing field.
Yeah.
But that's why I said, like, it used to be, that was always one of the most broken things, was it was like one team had the whiteboard and would draw and everybody else would sort of watch or be on the phone. And like your phone was filled with those photos of like whiteboards that said do not erase across the top. Yeah, again, I think the
Somebody
ability
had
to,
the pen. The pen was
oh,
power, wasn't it?
oh, 100%. Like, yeah, that was like king of the mountain for sure. It's like if you had the pen, you were the king. But I think the ability to do that, because, and again, how do you evolve it? Because you can go from sketches to wireframes to start bringing in designs. You can do design feedback that way of letting people mark things up. Like, I think that's a quantum shift. I think, obviously this, of the ability to do video, to look at how do you do this? How do you use breakout rooms? How do you do things like that? Those have been big shifts. I think, looking at how do we use Slack, like what I talked about before, that's a big shift. I think a lot of it really is that sort of migration away from the file, right? Or the physical thing in many cases. And like we said, I know there are some parts of the process where there has to be a physical thing and that's going to be different. But yeah, I think the more that you're able to do that, it really sort of helps everybody, because I think then everybody's also equally engaged. And I think that's a big part of it is, how do we put everybody on a level playing field? How do we, do those sort of things? And so, I think the more you can do that, those are the real game changers. But then also there's the recognition that, you can have all the tools in the world and still not get results. Again, I see so many teams that have the same tools, the same process. They hire people from the same places. One is wildly successful. The other one's a low grade dumpster fire. Like, again, I think it's also like, what are the rituals you put around it? Again, how are you being deliberate in the way that they're used that makes the difference?
So that's the culture, right? That's the old saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast, but culture eats tools for breakfast in this case.
Oh, yeah.
And so one of the things that you major on, and I love it, we talked about it back in London, is trust and the importance of trust. And you very articulately divide trust into practical trust and emotional trust, which I know not everyone on this will have listened to the podcast, sadly. Highly recommend it again. But maybe if you can just articulate a bit about that, Stephen, and remind us about the difference and why they're so important when it comes to remote working.
Yeah, well, I think, that for me, like, trust has always been the center of everything. Because I think if you look at, and again, we've done huge studies. We've looked at like 2,200 different companies. We've done a lot of different things to really identify what are high performing teams versus lower performing teams. And trust is a big part of what comes up a lot. And I think, especially as we've already talked about, in a format where I now need to trust that my people are working. Again, if you look at the companies that everybody always loves to fetishize in the design community, they do this crazy thing where they hire smart people and they trust them to do their jobs. But as I started to look into it, like, trust is not one dimensional. There's actually three types of trust. One is none, which is definitely a problem. Practical trust is whenever I trust somebody just to do the basics, right? Like, just to show up on time, turn something in whenever they say. It's just a very functional, fundamental sort of version of trust. And then there's emotional trust, which is that I actually believe that the people I work with are on my side. I believe that, again, what I'm doing is to try to help out the company or the team. You start to hear them use different words, where practical trust is like, I'm doing something or someone told me to. In emotional trust, it starts to become much more about, like, I believe in the leadership. I believe in our vision. My boss believes in me, those sort of things. And I think, especially in this format, that's where so many leaders are being challenged, because as you look at needing to push power down through your organization, if you don't want to paralyze your entire company, if you want to look at believing people are doing things, it means that you need to trust them. And I think as we've done more research on it, we've seen that if you look at high trust, high performing teams, on average, those people have about 100% more energy. They're 75% less stressed. They're about 50% more productive. They burn out about 40% less. They're about 30% more satisfied with their lives kind of outside of in the world. And so I think that there's a lot of those sort of things. But again, trust is one of those things that you sort of can't fake the funk on.
Yeah.
Like, you need to actually invest in other people. You need to actually listen and do some of those fundamental things, because if you just go through the motions, and that's where most companies struggle and why innovation gets short-circuited, is because when all you have is practical trust, so we're just asking and looking and developing the basics, but we are asking for outcomes that require emotional trust, so that we're going to take risks, we're going to be much more creative. That's often the divide of why their innovation doesn't work.
Yeah.
Is because if you're just working in a very fundamental, very functional way, but you're asking for much more high performing results, and again, you're not sort of putting KPIs or putting behaviors or putting things in place that encourage that, that's often the fundamental break of why, again, you can have every process in the world and you're still not going to get there.
So we've got one of the questions about how does psychological safety fit with trust? And is that the emotional trust? You feel safe to put your ideas out there. You know this person's got your back.
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting, psychological safety has become a very interesting term that I've seen in a lot of places. I think at its essence, yes, it is the fact that I feel like the people I work with can think about themselves and me. I feel like I can take a risk and that I will not be punished for it. I will be, and maybe I'll be pushed on it. Maybe I'll be, again, but I'm not going to be judged. I'm not going to be ostracized. I feel like I have that ability to do that. Again, I think psychological safety is, and like I said, I think there are some cases where this has gone a little bit too far in terms of how protected do people think they need to be. There's one leader in particular who I talked to who works at a large company who said, she had just gotten to start with working with a new team, had asked one of the designers to sort of turn their grid lines on because, they weren't really sort of aware of what the alignment was on something. And that designer went to HR and said they didn't feel psychologically safe to work on the team anymore. So,
yeah,
right. I think we, again, understandable. I think there needs to be a balance, but at the end of the day, you need to feel like, you are a part of the team, because if you look at successful teams in other contexts, look at sports, look at, again, as odd as it may be, the military, look at, music. Jazz is a living exhibition in sort of emotional trust. I mean, hell, even look at superheroes, right? Like the Avengers always struggle until they trust each other, and then we get $1 billion blockbuster. I think, you'll hear people sort of talk about, whenever they play with each other in sports, how they'll trust each other because you're doing it for the other people, not just for yourself. But I think that it really does get to that place where you feel like I can take a risk. I feel like I can do those sort of things. And that, again, it's not just going to be not ostracized, but it's actually respected and encouraged. And that those are those sort of things that we're looking for are, how can we have that sort of like courageous candor in those conversations?
Yeah, and that candor is important, isn't it? And having been watching The Last Dance, Michael Jordan was many, many things. He certainly had brilliance, but he was also a kind of candid critic. Sounds like some sort of new Disney show. But, this ability to actually not just be sort of able to say the nice things, but to say the things that improve our performance, because we're giving the truth, but we're giving the truth with their best interests at heart as a leader, rather than just making ourselves feel smarter or whatever it is, right? That sort of candor that you're referring
to. I think the best teams that I've ever been a part of, the best teams that I've ever led, the best teams that I've ever seen really aren't afraid to push each other, right? I mean, it's like whenever you show up and if you know that you aren't bringing your best ideas, if you're going to hear about it, even if you are bringing your best ideas, your team is going to try to break them, right? You're going to try to find what are the weak spots? How do we make each other? Because there's that sort of like steel sharpens steel sort of mentality. And again, I think, as you look at the time that I've spent working at Apple or with Google, like you will see that there is a real mentality of in some ways it may be a harsh word, of almost like brutality. Yeah. Of like, look, if it is not the best, it doesn't win. Yeah. And that there is a real part of that. And in that, there is a real level of honesty. There's a real level of candor. But again, there's also an incredible level of trust and respect for what it is we're trying to do, that what this is actually matters. And that, again, I think when you're able to get to those sort of places and that happens, like, this is why I've always said the work is the truth. Like, because you can look at the work and I can directly line it back to how functional is the culture? How much do they trust each other? What is going on? Because it's just, it isn't like, oh, if we do more work, our culture gets better. Look, I can tell you, if I ask for your org chart before we ever do a coaching session, and your org chart matches your website or your app navigation, I know exactly how siloed and screwed up your company is before we ever speak the first word, right? That sort of like shipping the org is a real thing. And I think that's sort of the part of where a lot of this stuff comes from. But yeah, I think those sort of things start to really take on a real importance, because, that's that thing, like it has to matter and you have to push each other. Because when you do that, that's where you do get the psychological safety. That's where you do get that performance and the work really goes up, because like, look, that the way we're going to handle this, if we're being honest, there is nothing a stakeholder, nothing a customer is going to say that we haven't already said to ourselves or haven't already thought about.
Yeah. There's another good question here, which is in that sort of same vein, which is about feedback. And I think feedback, I'm British, so God, feedback's hard. But, feedback is so important. We all know that. And again, I think it's one of those key functions of high-performing teams. But for both those of us who are giving feedback and those of us who are sort of receiving feedback, the question here is about what do you think about getting proper feedback about your own performance when you're physically detached?
Right.
Is it even possible to get something more in depth than just a checklist of work done and not done? You must be giving your colleagues feedback the whole time. And, how does it work well?
And I think, there's sort of the two realms of feedback. And it's funny. This is, I guess in all my sudden abundance of free time and lack of travel, like I actually started a YouTube channel for the podcast as well. And this was one of the big things I got asked about. I think that there's feedback as it faces two different ways, right? I think that if I'm giving feedback on work, there's sort of a ratio that I always use, which is this like 10-80-10 ratio, which is 10% of the time I want to give feedback, which is like, look, you all need to go figure this out, right? Like I don't want to encourage a culture where every time there's a problem, you come running to me to have it figured out. So it's like, look, you're going to need to figure out how do you invest in each other. 80% of the time, I want to speak only in like opportunities and problems, meaning, hey, I don't think we're addressing this. Have we thought about this? Those sort of things where, again, I'm respecting the team's creativity and thought process. I want them to be the ones that are doing this, but as a leader, I still need to have influence and to be able to guide it. So that sort of gives me the best of both worlds. And then 10% of the time, I am out of patience, time, budget, some political capital where it's like, look, just this needs to get done and this is what we're doing. But I think it's sort of leaving those two kind of 10% as the nuclear option. So I think that tends to be the mentality. And again, I think that works universally for feedback.
Yeah.
I do think, in many cases, you probably do need to heighten the number of times that you're getting feedback as a team for us to be able to say, look, what's working and what's not, right? Like your process probably needs to become much more of a living thing than what it's been in the past. I think as a leader, like, again, just try to do it like a start, stop, continue model, or to be able to do those things to specifically say, hey, look, how is it going? Because again, it's very easy to be like, well, nobody's complaining, or that sort of like, my door is always open. That shit didn't work before, and it definitely doesn't work now, because it's just the problems will go too far. People are going to be too, I don't know what, upset or damaged or something to be able to do that. So again, I think that ability to try to ask, but then also whenever the feedback comes back, to really listen to it. Say, okay, look, this is what we're going to do. This is the way we're going to action it. This is what it is. Because I think people being heard is such a big part of it. Like I said, that's why teams are breaking, because they don't feel like they're being heard, or their leadership just doesn't care. And I think that's one of the most alienating things, is whenever you just feel like, okay, look, I'm already struggling with this, but on top of that, if I just feel like I'm screaming into the void. But again, I think those sort of basic constructs of doing that gives you a really good pulse. And like I said, it's also, as a leader, don't feel like you have to have all the answers.
Yeah.
Like the ability to say, like, you know what, you're right, we're not doing this well. And I'm not sure that I understand what it is we're going to do here, but here's the plan of what we're going to do to put in place to try to figure out what we're going to do here.
Yeah, no, I think that all rings very true. And I shall try and be less British about my feedback.
I mean, one of my favorite things in the world is watching two British people argue. Partially because, like, when you come from New York, you're always like, are they fighting? Like, if they are, this is magical. But yeah, no, I know.
Yes, it's like some elfish dance, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it is fantastic.
You've talked a little bit about this pandemic in separate sort of channels, presenting a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rethink how we work as teams.
Yeah.
I know we've touched on lots of different themes, but what do you think are those key areas that leaders should really focus on evolving? What's going to stand us in good stead for the future?
Yeah, well, I think, for me, that is sort of the silver lining in all this. Is my hope is that we come out of this with an increased awareness of mental health, of trust, of rethinking leadership, but I think in many cases there is, that forced evolution to be able to do that. Because I think, historically, that's why innovation and things like that have been so almost, impossible to build. That's why, again, you hear me talk about how the innovation at most companies, for it to actually happen, had to be done in ways that wasn't authorized. But again, I think, because we're trying to sort of jump a full speed train from one track to another, this is our opportunity for everybody to try to work differently. And my favorite part of a job is like the first 6 months, because you can just sort of try anything because you're new. Congratulations, we're all new. But yeah, I think that, the thinking that I coach a lot of CEOs and a lot of leaders on is that really, for me, the mindset that I think is going to win is this sort of statement that I learned from a former CEO of mine whenever I was at Starwood. where he would always talk about how agile is the new smart. And I don't mean agile as an agile methodology, but I think our ability to organize our teams, our companies, our thinking to be more nimble, to be more responsive. Again, as you've seen the rise of design sprints and design thinking, I think a lot of this is us trying to get to this place. But our ability to respond to market forces, our customers, a pandemic, like any of these sort of things, and that ability to do that and to know we're going to need to work in different ways or do those sort of things. But I think to encourage that mindset where we need to be more nimble, we need to experiment more, we need to sort of drink the Kool-Aid of like all the things we always talk about. I think those are going to be the companies that are going to stand in the best stead, because again, we don't know. There could be a vaccine tomorrow. There could be one in 30 years. I mean, that's the thing when you think about it, and is the depressing part of it. Like, the AIDS virus, it took us 30 years to finally figure that out. And that was, again, something that affected a minority, and we didn't work on nearly the way we should have. But, and so again, I think as we don't have a crystal ball to be able to do that, I just don't think a lot of companies are going to have the luxury of time. And that, again, that ability to sort of really react is going to become super important.
One of our clients, Unilever, came out with Alan Joke, the CEO there, sort of was talking and just reminds me of what you said. I know they've been swamped with scenarios. Everyone's got 1,000 scenarios that they're dealing with, from everyone, McKinsey, anyone worth their salt's got a scenario. But he's saying, actually, we should be moving away from scenario planning, trying to focus on building agility and responsiveness into the company. And he goes on to say, I don't know that we should be spending too much time locking in particular scenarios or views for the future, but rather unleashing the trapped capacity that most big organizations have by letting go and letting people close to their markets, close to the front line, exercise their judgment and their decision making. We've discovered a new responsiveness in Unilever that I wish we'd unlocked years ago, but it's taken a crisis to do that. And that's what you're talking about, right?
100%. Because I think that's the thing, right? The scenario is uncertainty. And again, as we said before, and I think, he said it much more eloquently than I ever will, uncertainty has always been the scenario. The problem has been we sort of wanted to believe that if we put a roadmap together, we would be able to deal with that. In some cases, we were blinded by those roadmaps and launched a lot of stuff nobody cared about. But again, I think that's the thing for me, is that's what I tend to care for more than the scenario. Because look, I think it is important, right? But I think at the same point, looking at that mentality, understanding we're going to need to pivot. I mean, for me, I've been very pleasantly surprised with the number of massive companies that I'm talking to who are just saying, look, we're probably never going to go back to what it was before. I mean, you've already seen, Facebook and Twitter and Square and Dell and a bunch of others who have said, I know, Zuckerberg said last week, he thinks within 5 years, 50% of that company isn't going to be in an office. Again, I think they put some caveat on it to probably crush some people's dreams who thought they were going to take those big Silicon Valley salaries and go move to Iowa. But,
well, they spent a lot on real estate, haven't they, those guys?
But I think that there is that recognition that it is more of the mindset and how do we, sort of pivot on those sort of things. So I think that's the part of it for me, is that if you can care for and look at and just say, look, the constant is uncertainty. How do we minimize that? How do we increase our reaction time? How do we be able to do those sort of things? Because again, as we look at at Star Wars, that was the big pivot we made when all of a sudden we sort of broke out, was whenever we started to, instead of launching things to 1,100 hotels, we launched them to 2. We dropped the scale and we got more agile, and we just sort of reoriented how we did everything. And then, not surprisingly, that's when the innovation followed.
Stephen, there are a lot of people, and let's just cut to the wonderful work that Josh and Chris are putting together, which I know will be available at the end. We're going to have a kind of nice zoom out, and this is great stuff, guys. So I'm very impressive that you're able to do this remotely as well. Thank you so much. But there are a lot of people out there expecting you to have a sort of a crystal ball, I think, Stephen. And this is what comes when you're an authority figure like yourself. But people are asking about expectations of moving slowly back to the office, which some companies are starting to do. What do you see as the future for commuters and remote workers? I mean, do you have a view of what that future might look like?
Look, I think it's going to be hard to know. My prediction is I think it's going to be hard to put the genie back in the bottle. I think that there's a lot of people who have started to see, and I think that was always it was interesting, because in the past 2 years with InVision being 100% remote, it was always a little bit of like a circus sideshow, when it's like, oh, look at them, isn't that interesting? Oh, gee, aren't they doing that? Maybe someday. And then all of a sudden, and I think our argument was like, again, we're a company who has been successful, who happens to be remote, not a remote company. I think that, look, we're probably going to see a blend. I think we're going to start to see where this becomes a much more legitimate way of doing things. Because I think that's why I said the benefits of this are probably the trailing indicator here. But I think as companies start to realize the advantage, because again, that was why InVision was founded as 100% remote, because we said, look, if we want to compete for talent against Google and Apple and Facebook and all these other companies, we need to have an advantage. I can't tell you how insanely fantastic it is to be able to say, look, I just want to hire the best talent in the world, and I don't care where you live.
Yeah.
Like I work with people, like I said, they live in RVs, they live in the desert, and it's just like, great, like go and move back to be closer to your family, go improve your cost of living. Like, so again, I think that ability to just say, look, we can really, start to compete on talent. That's a very different thing. I think as we start to look at getting real work-life balance, the ability to focus, like, again, that ability to work from anywhere, not just from home, right? Because I think that's the other thing is that right now, with kids home, with a lot of those things, this is not, and especially those with teenage kids who started to ask me recently about what my position is on bailing them out of jail. Like I said, this is going to be, but I think as they also start to see those sort of indicators about, and I think, I've had, you talk about companies that own real estate who have said, look, we started to look at, if we slow down real estate development projects, what does that mean for what we can do for salary? I mean, I think, you're definitely going to see a reaction to this where highly concentrated, dense cityscapes aren't going to be, I think you're going to see that those are going to start to struggle because, people are going to want to move out to other places. I think you're going to start to see a migration of people who, are going to be able to rethink how they work and where they work and to do a lot of those sort of things. So again, I think those are going to be the things that are going to be predictive of that. But like, that's as big as the crystal ball is for me right now, just because, again, there's so many other variables.
And can I ask you, you are 100% remote. Is there anything that if you had 10% or 20% that wasn't remote, that you could go to a hub that would kind of enhance? Is there anything you guys miss?
Yeah, and so the interesting part is, even though we're 100% remote, it doesn't mean that we don't ever get together in person. Sure. And I think that there has been those sort of things that we do miss, because what the cadence used to be, once a year for a week, the entire company, so all 800, 900 people would fly into one place. We'd spend an entire week together.
Yeah.
Then the next quarter, kind of your team could pick anywhere that they wanted to meet. Okay. The next quarter, your division would pick someplace they want to meet. The next quarter, your team could pick someplace they wanted to meet. So again, there was that mix of like, while we're remote, we still did understand and value like why it was important to get together in person. Yeah. So I think, you definitely miss that, that ability to, again, where we all had cards for WeWork or for, you could go to a Starbucks, you could sort of shift and sort of lean into that work from anywhere more. I think you definitely miss that. But I think that there are those sort of things as well that definitely do become an important part of it, where it isn't just this sort of thing where you're sort of living screen to screen.
Yeah. No, it's nice to share a coffee or something stronger with a colleague, isn't it? Like, there is, I think a lot's now been written about Zoom fatigue, but human beings are sort of evolved over the many millennia to pick up a lot of signals in person that Zoom doesn't necessarily allow. I've always been struck by the fact you are actually never making eye contact, because I'm obviously not looking at my camera, because that'd be weird. Right. I'm looking at the screen, which makes a lot more sense, but you never pick that up.
Probably one of the biggest hacks that I can tell people, like if you want to be able to actually reduce your Zoom fatigue a little bit, is if you're on Zoom, go in under your thumbnail, hit the 3 little dots, and there's something in there that's called hide self view.
Yes.
You are drastically more engaged, and it actually reduces fatigue, because most of the time you're sitting there like, look, like, is my goatee, like, what's going on in the background? And so again, I think like even just that, because like you don't sit next to a mirror whenever you're in a conference room, you actually focus on other people. So yeah, I think that's one of my favorite hacks to tell people is like, turn off self view, because that makes a big difference.
No, one of my colleagues is a consumer psychologist, Stephen, and he absolutely, he's all over this narcissism stuff as well. It's human, it's human nature. He explained to me very kind of carefully and eloquently, and it's all gone out in one ear and out the left as to why we spend so much time looking at each other, ourselves rather than each other. But we're kind of fascinated.
Right.
Just as we kind of come to the final few minutes, if there was one thing you'd urge every remote leader to do, and you've given us so much richness, but if there was one thing that would have a really significant positive impact on themselves or on their team, what would that one thing be?
I think it's a good question, but I think, for right now, the biggest one for me is just make it okay to not be okay. I think for yourself, to give yourself that sort of break, because, again, I think, like empathy fatigue is real. I think especially at a time in leadership, whenever most of the time what you're dealing with more than anything is probably trying to generate hope. Like
Yeah.
these are things that are not insignificant lifts, but I think also just sort of giving people permission to be human. And as
Yeah.
strange as that may sound, like I said, I think there's a real performance aspect that a lot of people will do of how do I need to show up the way I need to do? I'm perfectly fine. And whenever you sort of like get that one-on-one or do something and go like, look, how are you really doing? And you sort of watch them start to crumble a bit. Again, they need to be able to say, look, I'm not 100% today. They need to be able to say, look, something came up with the dog, the child, the grandparent, somebody else. I need to deal with that today. And again, I'll do the work some other time. You need to be able to trust them and do those sort of things. Because again, I think those sort of things that are going to make the biggest difference. Those are the things that have always driven innovation, are teams that work that way. But that's why I said, I mean, for me, it's just really that simple thing of just like having those conversations, even being, because I mean, I think for me as a leader, I've always tried to really invest in, I try to be extremely vulnerable as a person to say what it is that I'm struggling with. I think so that there's a lot of vulnerability and even uncertainty that can be there for what I'm going through, just so that, again, I'm modeling the behavior.
Yeah.
But again, as we talk about the direction of the team and what we're going, that tends to be much more definitive, something we can work on together, something you can believe in. But I think separating those two things, because I think that's where a lot of leaders are just starting to break down, because they're just like, look, I'm just running from fire to fire, and sort of they're not even taking care of themselves.
I think that's so true. And our mantra at Brand Genetics is about human first. And that comes to understanding your users or your consumers actually as human beings. That's the sort of core, but actually treating your colleagues as human beings and treating your clients as human beings. And I think that sometimes we've had these conversations where, we've been on the phone with clients who are, visibly upset or just having a stressful time. And I find that really heartwarming that we can, open up to one another in a more personal way than perhaps you would in a formal meeting room, because we're all human beings, all trying to grapple with a very, out of the ordinary situation. I've used so many euphemisms to describe this pandemic. I've given up on saying anything interesting, but I just think, as you say, this is actually, there are 4 contagions, and my colleague explained to me, of a pandemic. There's the contagion, the biological contagion. There's the contagion of fear and anxiety, and that lasts. There's the contagion of misinformation, and certain leaders of the world are very good at that. And finally, there's a contagion of kindness. And I think that if there's one positive thing that comes out of this, it's that we are all a little bit kinder to one another and treat each other more as human beings.
Yeah, no, and I definitely think that's true. And I'd also say, just again, if anybody knows anybody who's been affected, who has been laid off, so there's a small group that started something called the Amazing Design People List, and I think this was very much geared to try to help the design community. So if you've lost your job, you can get listed and sort of show that you're looking for work, which I think is a big difference we don't see. We've got about 200 active jobs of companies that are still actively hiring. And right now we've got about 200 of probably the world's like most amazing mentors. So to help people look at their portfolios, look at their resumes. But I think, that ability to really sort of try to give be the reason why somebody has hope makes a huge difference.
Well, Stephen, that's a wonderful note to end on. I would say thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy man. I know you've got to be in about 3 different countries today within the space of a few hours, but it's been so rich. And thank you for kicking off our GIF webinars. There will be a recording for all of you available on our YouTube channel tomorrow. You can still sign up for our free upcoming webinars. And this sort of, I think it's Tuesday next week, the 2nd of June, is Adriana Murray, who's a theoretical physicist and space enthusiast. She'll be talking about thinking big from home with Craig Whiteman of Kinnear do 4. So do tune in. She's fantastic as well, real inspiration. If you think that, she's been thinking about going and living on Mars. So, frankly, lockdown has nothing on that. I think, we're going to switch back now just to the drawing that Chris and Josh of Live Illustration have been doing. Again, I think some wonderful themes there, the different kinds of trust coming out. The truth is uncertainty, this opportunity to really unlock that potential, finding ways to delineate your time. Guys, I think you've brilliantly captured so much of what Stephen says. I definitely, I know it's not all there, but that's what the video is for. But you've picked out some real highlights. So look, I think, you know, that's enough from me. Stephen, thank you once again. Thank you to everyone in the GIF community. I hope we can all help one another. And as Stephen says, if you know people who are struggling, point them in the direction of that website, or, you know, reach out to them. Everyone appreciates a WhatsApp or a text message or a phone call, or whatever it is, just to say, hi, how are you doing? You know, and have a chat. It's okay to not be okay. On that note, guys, stay well and thank you very much.